Well, welcome and thanks for being here. I always get a little bit of stage fright when I have to do something like this. After all these years, I still get nervous. Um, but anyway, mysticism, one of my favorite topics. This I'm calling this presentation the what and why of mysticism. Now, if you saw the little poster thing, I come into the topic of mysticism in a couple of different ways. Uh, I think part of it is Carrie, because I didn't really know the word that well. I kind of did. But when we first met in seminary, she said to me at one point, she said, "You're kind of a closet mystic, aren't you?" And I sort of thought about that. I'm like, yeah, I guess so. And so that was maybe the first time I really thought about that seriously. Since then, of course, I've immersed myself in different studies and then my own sort of personal uh, religious life, faith life, devotional life, and so on, uh, have kind of led me down that. Well, you'll hear some more about that now. I don't need to tell you all that right now, but so I come into the topic in a variety of ways. I'd like to actually see what I did there with the pictures. I got the here on Earth with trees and the sun and all kind of mystical and then the cosmos because it's both of those things, right? So I want to start with this quote. Well, as far as I know, I'm quoting myself, but maybe I heard it from someone I don't know, or heard something like this. But uh, when we become silent, we may learn something about God, but we will certainly learn something about ourselves. So I want to begin with silence because in all of the mystical traditions of the world, silence plays an important part, and I think we'll get into that more as we explore, um, some of the practical sides of mysticism, and but I'd like to begin with a minute of silence. So not as a prayer time. I'm not using a prayer bowl on purpose because I don't want this. I don't. I find that when I use a prayer bowl, bong, because I've used it for a certain thing. There's this thing that clicks in my head, in my body, and I go into a certain mode, right? Meditation mode. But that's not what I want to do. I don't want to do that. And when we go into the silence, I don't want you to jump into whatever meditation practice you may, or maybe you don't have one, but if you do have one, if you do centering prayer, maybe the temptation is to go right into the centering prayer thing. Or if you do breath exercises or whatever, your temptation may be to go into that. I don't want you to do that. I want you to just be silent for 1 minute. So I'll begin it, I'll time it, and then I'll just quietly call it to an end. Let's begin. All right, you can come out of the silence. And if this were a retreat, I would, we'd go around the circle and just ask for what you experienced. Uh, but I think, well, the thing I want to emphasize is, as I said, in every mystical tradition, silence plays an important part. And because you'll see that all of the mystical traditions have something to do with leaving the ordinary, at least for a while, to explore and discover and move into something out of the ordinary. But it really begins inside yourself. That's really where that exploration begins. So, oops, I went backwards. There we go. So let's do a few definitions here. So mysticism comes from the Greek word mysterion, which simply means that which is hidden. And so our word mystery obviously comes from that, because a mystery is something that's hidden. In the ancient world, sacred things were believed to be veiled, to be hidden. In other words, they were mysteria. And that was just an assumption of the ancient world, and really everywhere. And we'll get into some of the details of these things as we get into the different traditions and so on. Now, words usually don't exist by themselves. They usually exist in contexts of ideas and associations and so on and so forth. So the related word to mysterion is the Greek word apokalypsis, where we get our word apocalypse from, obviously. But what it means is pulling away the veil, or pulling away, apokalypsis, pulling the veil away. And so you get the Latin word from that, revelatio, which means the same thing, revela, right? The veil, pulling the veil away. So the veil that's being pulled aside to reveal the mysteries of the spiritual world or of spiritual sight. And so again, if you go back to the silence, we live in a world that's veiled by our distraction, right? We're always distracted by things, especially visual things, but also audio things and so on. But even more than that, just the thoughts and the preoccupations that go on in our heads, and they mask, they hide deeper things because we're too busy paying attention to those. So silence becomes a tool to pull aside that veil, to reveal the mystery that's hidden within or beyond. And again, the tree and the cosmos thing that I use, because it's always about within, but also beyond. That's why silence may reveal something to us about God, but it certainly will tell us something about ourselves. In modern English, the modern English word mysticism is now used as a sort of a general term for spiritual paths that seek to get in touch with the divine, or to arrive at some deeper state, or at a higher state, or some state of transcendence or enlightenment. Also implying seeing more clearly, so insight, right? So it's a very broad term, and applies to a lot of different, again, traditions and details and so on and so forth. And there was a time, starting in the Enlightenment into the sort of late 20th century, where mysticism was a bad word because it was associated with, flaky or ecstatic religion, or all these kinds of things that weren't generally accepted in the university. And I think since then, there's been a better appreciation of what it is, and looking back into, again, the religious traditions of the world, we see it, right? So most faith traditions have some version of mysticism, or something we could call mystical. And so, for example, in First Nations traditions, there are things like vision, what we call vision quests, and probably in each culture they have different names for that. But where you leave behind the ordinary, you go out into a place, and you're getting in touch with the nature that's there, the world that's there, but you're also getting in touch with yourself. You're doing this kind of dual thing again, that's both internal and external. And out of that comes some new identity or some new insight or some new name, or there's all kinds of different practices or different details about that. There isn't just one thing, but it is it's a going deeper at both levels. In the classical Mediterranean religions, there is, for example, the Eleusinian Mysteries, which was very elaborate. This took place in Greece. It was a very elaborate system of initiations and so on and so forth to be allowed into the mysteries of the religion, and there were other kinds of mystery cults. And so again, it's you leave behind ordinary life, you embark on this elaborate sort of initiation thing. It was like a mini, what would you call it, pilgrimage, sort of a mini pilgrimage within a defined religious complex. In Hinduism, you have sannyasa, the concept of renunciation. You renounce the world, and moksha, liberation, liberated from attachment to the things of this world. And so the sannyasi, or the sannyasinis, that's the male and the female version of the word, the one who has renounced the world, also sometimes called a sadhu or a swami, leaves everything to pursue the highest goals of the Hindu life, which are actually to not be attached to things. Now, that may sound very familiar because that's a lot like Buddhism. And in sort of classical Buddhism, the Buddhism I know the best is Theravada Buddhism, the Thai Vietnamese type Buddhism. We follow the Dharma, the teaching to attain anatta, which is non-self, right? The self is an illusion. The self is just a complex mix of attachments. And so as we let go of those attachments, the self dissolves, and thus we arrive at nirvana, which is extinction, right? That's the sort of the highest ideal of classical Buddhism. But we also see, for example, in the Tibetan pre-Buddhist tradition of Dzogchen, we see something a lot like centering prayer, where you let go of thoughts, let go of thoughts, let go of thoughts, let go of thoughts. So these are just different kinds of mystical traditions, or things that can be called mystical, because you're getting connected to something bigger, something beyond yourself. You're leaving the ordinary behind and discovering something larger or transcendent or deeper that's undiscovered, has been undiscovered. That's a mysterion, that's a mystery, and that you're pulling the veil aside to discover. Taoism has, you can interpret Taoism as a kind of mysticism, in the sense that Taoism is about being in harmony with the natural order, right? The Tao is about aligning your life with the natural order. So it's a different kind of mysticism, but again, it's about surrendering my individual kind of choices and predilections and so on and so forth, in order to be in harmony with something that's bigger than myself. And there's a kind of social parallel to that in Confucianism, where it's about the subversion of the social structures. And then in Shintoism, it's about submitting to the Kanagara, which is the word, the kami, or the spirits. So it's, there's a kind of parallel thing to Tao. I don't know that much about Shintoism, so that's just something I read. And in Judaism, now Judaism has a very deep mystical tradition too, and I don't even know where to begin with describing some of that. And we'll probably get into some of that next week as we talk about Christian tradition, because Christianity and Judaism are kind of joined at the hip, and the hip is called the Hebrew Scriptures. So actually, the New Testament too, Jesus, the disciples, we're all kind of connected there. But the most well-known mystical tradition of Judaism is Hasidism, which began in the 1600s as a kind of a renewal movement. But there is this strong tradition of, kind of surrendering yourself into the joy of, the joy of the law, the joy of Shabbat, it's seeing God in every little thing and so on and so forth, which again has a lot of parallels in Christianity too. And then finally, in Islam, there's Sufism. And if you've ever read Rumi, he would be considered a mystical poet because, again, it's this connection between the divine and the ordinary, and the divine infuses the ordinary. And it's really about seeing differently, pulling the scales away from your eyes, or pulling the veil away so that you see differently. But then there are the dervishes, which are more of an ecstatic kind of thing, which developed out of Sufism. The the spinning dance in order to put yourself into a trance-like state. Oh yeah, that's in Hasidism. That's what I wanted to talk about. In Jewish prayer, traditional Jewish prayer, you'll often see the person praying, wrap their scarf around their prayer shawl around them, and they'll rock back and forth. That's called shaukeln, and that's just like dervishes. That's the same thing, to use the body's what's that called? That system, the system in the body that orients you, keeps you balanced and stuff.
Vestibular.
That's it. They use the body's vestibular system to create a kind of sort of almost like a lightheaded state, but that's the same kind of thing. That's like silence. It's to let go of all those distracting thoughts, but also the distracting sensations, and to just come into the prayer and to lose oneself in the prayer. So again, it's a letting go and a moving past, and so on and so forth. So that's the kind of the basic intro stuff I wanted to put out there. And I wonder if you have any questions at this point. And I'm going to stop my share. And that, because your questions may also help me focus better next week's presentation, so that I maybe address some of the bigger issues, some of the bigger questions you may have, or some of the misunderstandings, or anything like that. So does anyone have any questions or clarification points, or? I don't know that much about are the African traditions, but I wonder how some of the dancing in various African traditions maybe serves the same purpose, right? The same kind of, if you're dancing and dancing and dancing, you get into a certain.
I agree.
Or I've heard a First Nations person talking about even doing fancy dancing or something like that, just the kind of dancing and dancing and dancing and dancing just continuously for a long time, how it puts you into a certain kind of state, right? This sort of a prayer state. So the dance itself becomes the prayer, and of course, while you're doing that, all that other stuff is gone, is pushed aside, and so I mean, we're talking kind of in the technique area, and there are lots of different techniques, and maybe we will definitely get into some of that next week, but absolutely, yeah. And that would make sense, because the last thing you want to do while you're praying is be agitated or meditating. You want to be calm. That's the breathing is the same thing, the rhythmic breathing. If you take 3 deep breaths, if you do that, you slow your heart rate down by a certain amount. It calms you down. And I think, if you think about Judaism in particular, where there's been so much kind of persecution and oppression and stuff if you study the history of Judaism, and especially of the relationship between Christianity and Judaism, or let's say the Christian, Christian nations, and Judaism over the last 2,000 years, you can't help but, say, wow, why do they even trust us with anything? And so if you're living in this kind of oppressed state, you think about Hasidic Judaism comes from Poland in the 1600s, and the Polish regime wasn't particularly oppressive at the time, but they were a minority, a religious minority, and to develop this kind of way of doing that to soothe yourself is like, when I come to prayer, I need to block all of that stuff out and just not even think about that, because that's too hard. So it makes sense. That all makes sense, and we discover it however we need to discover it. And once one person is doing it, then everybody starts doing it. So I'm going to do one more screen share here, and I want to. Speaking of the Christian tradition, I want to move us ahead and set us up for next week a little bit. By inviting you to think a little bit differently about some things, and maybe for you it's not that different, but let me go back to my share, and let me go back to, it's still full screen, that's good. So in the Christian mystical tradition and in the Jewish mystical tradition, there's a certain way of reading biblical texts. And so you learn to begin to look at biblical texts as mystical metaphors. So here you're pulling aside the literal sense of the text, the veil, to uncover the mystical sense. Now that's an old tradition, and it's a pre-Christian tradition. It is how Middle Platonist philosophers. How did I get back on Middle Platonism again? I talked about that last time, didn't I? Middle Platonist philosophers read Plato, and how Plotinus reads Aristotle and Plato and other philosophers. That is to say that there's the idea that there's some kind of a deeper meaning. And so Judaism has this. Christianity, if you look at the way the New Testament uses the Old Testament, or sorry, that's my Lutheran coming there through it. The New Testament uses the Hebrew scriptures. It's in this kind of metaphorical way. We would say Christological, right? So they see Christ in texts where there is no Christ. But this is a little bit different from that. This is kind of looking at the themes in there, and what do they tell us kind of spiritually, right? So, for example, looking at Genesis 2 and 3, so that's, God creates the man and the woman in the garden, and sets them in the garden, and and then the whole serpent thing happens and all that kind of stuff. And if you get wrapped up in the literal details, you sort of miss the forest for the trees. But this becomes a kind of an image, sort of an icon, you could say, a verbal icon of that we're created to have this natural intimacy with God. That the archetypes of the humans, the man and the woman, are created to have this natural intimacy with God, but something gets in the way. Something distracts. Something pulls them away, right? And so, with this text in particular, I have this kind of axe I grind, is that the traditional Christian theological overlay blinds us from the more subtle details and dynamics in the story. And I wrote this long, I don't know, 50-page thing about that. But the basic dynamic is we're created to exist in this kind of, easy intimacy with God, but something gets in the way, something distracts us, pulls us away. And from that point on, it's always about trying to get back to that, trying to get, recover that. And so if we use that as a sort of jumping off place for our reflections, then we say, well, yes, you're right. We are always distracted from that natural intimacy. And so we need these techniques to help us, touch a little bit of that again, come back to that a little bit again. So in Genesis 5:21-24, we have this story of Enoch. Enoch walked with God, then he was no more because God took him. So this is that section of Genesis where it's these patriarchs, these early patriarchs who all live like 1 billion years, right? And they all die. I mean, they all after 500 years or 600 years or whatever. But then comes this Enoch, and apparently he doesn't die. He just was no more because God took him. So Enoch becomes this kind of symbol of one who has that kind of intimacy, so that the translation to the next state is so natural. It's like there's no barrier there anymore, right? He just goes, and there he is, and in a sense, recreates that kind of intimacy. So what happens to the character of Enoch later in Second Temple Judaism is that he becomes this archetype of the one who reveals the mysteries, right? Because he gets to go up there and he sees stuff. And so the book of Enoch is this long book of the structure of the heavens and all this kind of stuff is revealed. But again, getting away from the literal and thinking about it thematically, that when we have this natural to and fro with the larger, the transcendent, and so on and so forth, even death begins to take on a different quality for how we approach it or receive it. And then in Genesis 12 and in Ruth, we have what I think of as the archetypes of the ones who set out on the spiritual journey. So for Genesis 12 with Abraham, go to a land that I will show you. In Ruth, where you will go, I will go, your God will be my God, your people will be my people. So Abraham and Ruth are sort of symbols for seekers who leave all behind, leave the familiar behind, to go on a journey to something. And they're not even sure where that is, what that's going to look like, how that's going to end. But along the way, they experience things, they grow, they have challenges, they have setbacks, but they along the way are also learning that kind of connection, right, to the divine and so on and so forth. But neither of them are detached from the world in the sense that they're not living in the world. They are absolutely living in the world. They're eating and having to find food and so on and so forth. But they are on this spiritual journey. So the mystical endeavor is a journey, but it's largely an interior journey. And the mystical endeavor is also a disciplined journey. It takes some kind of commitment. Abraham doesn't say, well, I'll go for a little bit and I'll see what happens. And if I don't like it, I'll go back. Ruth doesn't say, okay, Naomi, well, I'll come with you, but if things don't work out, I'm just going to come back home. She says, I'm committed to this. And we'll see as we get into the kind of the Christian tradition, we'll see the importance of that personal discipline, that personal commitment to something, to this journey. And usually that also then means adopting certain practices that are just become the technique, really. But the point of the technique is to facilitate the the journey. So that's kind of my setup for next week. So having heard that, any thoughts, any points of resonance or recognition? Well, and those metaphors, they're out there, and I think there aren't as many people now who know them as they did at one time, but they are out there. And when you learn to use these things as metaphors, they become powerful ways to think about your life and existence, and the challenges you have, and so on and so forth. And I think biblical literalism is a blight upon the church and the world. Sorry, I have expressed my personal opinion here. So anyway, what was I going to say? Yeah. So and what's interesting about this too is this makes me think of, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but I think this is a really important story. The Benedictine monk who's associated with beginning centering prayer. So Thomas Keating tells this story back in the 50s and 60s, I think it was. And there were all these young Catholics who were going to South Asia, East Asia, and India to learn meditation and all this kind of stuff. And so they were kind of talking about this in the Benedictine monastery there and saying, why are they doing this, right? We have it right here. And so they had an insight that in what had happened in the Roman Catholic Church is that all of these things, all of these kind of mystical traditions had gotten shut up in the monasteries and the convents. And so monks and nuns knew all about it. And they knew all about meditation and breathing and They knew all about that kind of stuff. But ordinary Catholics were not really told about this. They were told to, pray your rosary and come to the days of obligation and do all these kind of more mechanical things. And it's because there was a kind of an elitism that said, well, you're not ready for that, right? Who knows what they'll do with this, right? So, and it's because of the historical experience of the arising of heresies and things like Lutheranism, for heaven's sake. God, horrible. And so he said, we've got to get this out there somehow, right? And so basically they packaged a particular type of prayer, which we now call centering prayer, which is represented in the cloud of unknowing. I'll talk about that next week a little bit. And got it out there as a program to try to get the word out, right? So that's what happened there. Well, go back 400 years earlier, and one of the mistakes that the Protestants made was, this stuff was kind of caught in the monasteries and in the convents. When Protestantism dissolved the monastic institutions, they basically lost most of this stuff. It just disappeared. And Protestantism became all about the sermon on a Sunday, and it became this very kind of, intellectual up here thing, and you got to believe certain things. And there was a part of Protestantism that became very shallow because it lost these deeper mystical traditions. And there were attempts by different Protestant teachers and preachers and so on to try to bring it back in, often met with a lot of resistance. A lot of hostility because it was seen as being too Catholic or too, medieval or whatever it was. And so there's a whole story there of different attempts at revival movements and so on and so forth. And but this is part of how the word mysticism became a bad word in the 19th century and the 20th century, early or first 2/3 of the 20th century, before people began to look back again and study it a little bit more again and come to appreciate it a little bit more again, and to realize that it's a very deep well to draw on that has a lot to offer us if we're willing to look, and get rid of our preconceived notions and so on. So was that a response to someone's question, or was that was a tangent, wasn't it? I do that sometimes. Anyway, any other thoughts, questions, and so on? And so, like I said, next week we'll get into the Christian tradition and the parts of it that I know better. So I'll get into the Desert Fathers, fathers and mothers, the the desert tradition would be another way to put that, and the Philocalia tradition, which is sort of an extension of that. But then also look at some medieval mystics, look at some Protestant movements. You know, Quakerism really starts as a kind of mystical movement, really, sort of a very democratic sort of mystical tradition, and and just look at them and explore some of the main points of what they're saying or experiencing or encountering. And then in the third session, what I want to do is just get into more of an application thing for ourselves and kind of some suggestions for practice. And you too can be a mystic. Yeah, and I think there's usually a teacher involved in these mystical traditions. There's usually some sort of teacher pupil relationship somewhere, and sometimes it's more intentional. Sometimes it's it can take different forms, but in the kind of the serious traditions, there's there's usually somebody teaching somebody, and and um, and this makes me think of, I don't know if any of you ever read the book by A.J. Abrams called The Year of Living Biblically. Anyway, so it's this New York Jewish fellow. He writes for the New Yorker. He's very suave and intellectual and everything, and he takes on these projects, and then he writes about his experiences. That's kind of his thing that he does, or was doing for a while anyway. And so he decided he would read through the entire Bible, and he would take out everything that looked like a commandment, and he would try to live by the commandment, literally. Right. So it's, but he, not all at once, but over the course of a year, as he works his way through, he would kind of do this. And he did have religious relatives, but in his own kind of immediate family, they were secular Jews. He says in there, I'm Jewish, like an olive is Italian. That's kind of one of his lines in there. So he talks about this moment he had once. He said he's never really been religious or had any kind of religious experience. He said the closest thing was one time when he was in his early 20s, he was on the train and he was looking out the window, and he had this moment when he felt connected to the universe. He just felt this sense of connection to everything, that all was kind of one, right? And it was this amazing feeling. And then by the time he arrived in the station, it was gone. And he put it up to, something I ate or whatever, so weird, and he moved on. But when I read that, I thought, it's too bad that he didn't have a relationship with a rabbi, because he could have gone to that rabbi and said, I had this experience on the train. Does that mean anything? Uh, and the rabbi probably would have been able to say, well, maybe it might, and introduce him a little bit to, prayer, mysticism, whatever. But of course, he didn't have that. He didn't have that connection, and so that shows again the importance of the community, the kind of the faith community, and the presence of those who are further along the path to kind of pass on the information, or to say, oh yeah, this. And in Judaism again, there is a tradition in the Talmud that when it comes to matters like this, things that we would call mysticism, or these kind of more hidden things, there's a tradition that you're not supposed to, as a teacher, take anyone on to teach this until they turn 40, because they're not ready. They haven't had enough life experience yet until they're 40 to really understand what's going on there. And that's kind of an interesting thing in our dialect in Germany, in southwestern Germany. It's Schwaben. That's what we speak Schwäbisch. We have a saying, der Schwab wird erst mit 40 gescheit. The Schwabian doesn't get smart until he turns 40. And so it's a weird little parallel there to this Jewish thing. But I experienced that for myself, that I didn't really find my way into this topic in any kind of meaningful way. I didn't appreciate this topic really until I was in my 40s. That's really when things began to sort of gel for me. So, maybe if you're Simeon, the new theologian in 11th century Byzantium, and you're in your 20s and you have this amazing mystical experience, maybe that's okay. But for the rest of us, maybe we just need to get to a certain stage in our lives. Yes, yeah, it would, and it has to be the right teacher too. Sometimes you just don't gel with the person, or they have too many agendas. Some people are so wrapped up in the legalistic side of that, and I don't know, that's just not helpful. I think you want somebody to push you a little bit, to suggest and so on, but not somebody to lay a guilt trip on you. Or if they're doing that, then run away quick. So what's really interesting is that the 1600s are a time when there are a lot of these renewal movements begin, that have this kind of mystical side to them. And it's at the same time that you have this move toward rationalism. And so it's almost like there's a reaction because, like in the Hasidism is a reaction to the dry intellectual state of Judaism in Poland at the time. That it was all about the laws and following the laws and doing the things and doing your things right. And the Baal Shem Tov comes along and says, no, it's about the joy. It's about, experiencing God, going out. Baal Shem Tov used to go out and walk in the woods and talk to the birds. He was kind of like St. Francis, and would have these ecstatic experiences out there and come into town and share them. And he just made up these songs out of, just these la 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 la. You can just imagine the kind of person he was. And so that's the beginning of Hasidism, right? As this kind of joyful, now of course, Orthodox Judaism is kind of, as all things, calcified into this, that, and the other thing in different places. But that's the original spirit of Hasidism. Well, at the same time, late 1600s, you have in Germany, you have the beginning of Pietism, which is all about people taking things, instead of just listening to the pastor preach a dry, dusty, theologically astute sermon, which is called Lutheran Orthodoxy. As long as you believe right, you will be saved. Saying no, it's more than that. It's about prayer, and it's about service and so on and so forth. And of course, Lutheran Pietism, and together with the Bohemian Brethren movement, sponsored by Count Nicholas von Zinzendorf, influences Charles Wesley, who takes these ideas back to England, and then he develops his Methodism, his movement of Methodism, which is about kind of breathing new life into the Church of England and so on and so forth. But also you have the Quakers, and you have I can't remember. Anyway, I don't know the English Reformation that well, but you have these different movements at the same time that are sort of reacting to the rationalism, right? And of course, out of the Age of Reason grows the Enlightenment, which takes that whole thing a step further. And so I think what happens then is that these movements that began in the late 1600s, it's not so much that they go underground, it's that they find their home often among working class people or rural people, but the urban, smart, urban, educated people, you just don't do that kind of stuff, right? So that's kind of where it goes, and it just keeps going. That you get the Great Awakening in the early 1700s in England, and then in the U.S. you have the Second Great Awakening in the early 1800s, and it's this. It wants to come out. It wants to come out, and I think what the Roman Catholic Church did, because they wanted to control everything and have it contained, is every time something happened, as long as it was contained within certain parameters, they would give it an order. Here's your order, and you can practice this in this order, as long as you acknowledge the authority of the church, and don't stray into these heresies and so on and so forth. And of course, Protestantism did not do that, and it's kind of turned into different denominations and so on and so forth. So I think it's out there, and it takes different forms, but the Protestant disease, which is splitting off every time you don't like something, that's what I call it. I call it the Protestant disease. The problem is that it's often uninformed. It's someone who knows just enough to be dangerous. And again, that's what the medieval church was trying to contain. Is a lot of these heresies were people who knew just enough Latin to read just enough of the Bible to get it wrong. But if you go into the deeper traditions that aren't wrapped up in all of that kind of stuff, right? And we'll get into that next week some more. Like you get into, the cloud of unknowing, St. John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, the Brethren of the Common Life, and you see these common, Meister Eckhart and so on, and you see this kind of basic thing. But then for me, what really put it together was reading the Philocalia tradition, which is the Eastern Orthodox tradition that's contained in this volume, or it's 4 volumes in English, called the Philocalia, which are these early Christian mystics, the desert tradition, and the ones after that, writing about their experiences in what I call the laboratory of the cell, right? One of the Desert Fathers said, "Go to your cell; it will teach you everything you need to know." And so that's that same thing. The silence may teach you something about God, but it'll certainly teach you a lot about yourself, right? So that's really different from some of this other stuff that we see happening in the 1700s and 1800s. These kind of reactions to other things, but. Is that sometimes you can find that connection in a thing you didn't realize you could make the connection through. You know what I mean? Like the rosary, right? The rosary could become the tool, even though for a long time maybe you were just doing a rote kind of thing, right? And I think there are a lot of people who find great inspiration in a poem, powerful poem, whether it's writing the poem or reading the poem. It's a form of worship. It's a form of prayer in the sense of connecting to something larger. I think probably astrophysicists, cosmologists, worship in, peering deeply into the universe, and that's pulling the veil aside, right? The thing that's been hidden from us. We see, this new telescope and you see all these things you'd never seen before, like the veil has been pulled away, or the apocalypsis, the veil has been pulled away, and wow, it's amazing. And then how you interpret that, I mean, that's up to you. You know, whether you just interpret that as the isn't the universe amazing, or behold the hand of God. I mean, whatever. I mean, that's up to you. How you work that out within yourself. Whatever is kind of meaningful. But the point is, you've connected to something much bigger, than you are. Huge, enormous. And then it works the other way too, as you go smaller and smaller into, subatomic space and so on, and within yourself, right? You get to know, and I do want to get into that next time, is especially Evagrius of Pontus and the examination of one's inner universe, and how that hangs together, and what we're paying attention to, right? Which is kind of Buddhist without being Buddhist. So